Hello, 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 and welcome to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and I am so excited for this episode. I've learned in hosting this podcast thus far that when I assume something will happen in a certain way, it inevitably happens another way. And so it is with this episode. I went into it intending to tell the stories of two men. Both stories ended up being too good to isolate to only one episode. So today, I will be telling you the incredible tale of the many, many, many escapes of Dr. Henry T. Helmbold. So come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. I have many resources that I use for this episode, and just a quick shout out and thank you to newspapers.com. So I'll include them at the end of the transcript for this episode, but a large portion of my information comes from the book, Am I a Lunatic? Or Dr. Henry T. Helmbold's Exposure of Personal Experience in the Lunatic Asylums of Europe and America by Henry T. Helmbold. I couldn't find a lot of information about Henry Helmbold's childhood and early adulthood. I was able to find that he was born in 1826. I would have liked to have learned more about his family of origin and what maybe drew him into his later type of work. We know that he didn't go to medical school, but he still called himself a doctor, as was disturbingly common in those days. People could claim that they had the key to wellness and could simply dub themselves a doctor, which is essentially what Dr. Henry Helmbold eventually did. I'd also like to know how he came across the substance that would later become a key element to his successful product. But that's also something I wasn't able to find. What we know is that somehow, in some way, Dr. Helmbold came across the buchu plant of South Africa. One article notes that, quote, the leaves of the buchu plant, a small woody shrub, had long been used in South Africa by indigenous peoples as a traditional medicine. By 1840, the herb was officially recognized in America's pharmacopoeia for irritations of the bladder and urethra and for disease of the prostate, end quote. Dr. Helmbold essentially appropriated the use of this plant for his own fame and monetary gain. The same article calls it, quote, a watered-down concoction of buchu with cubebs, licorice, caramel, molasses, peppermint, and, of course, alcohol, end quote. Dr. Helmbold went on to claim that his buchu drink could cure a range of ailments, everything from the previously known treatments for the bladder to the more grandiose, general debility, depression, imbecility, confused ideas, hysteria, diseases of the kidney, emaciation, constipation, epilepsy, even paralysis. Dr. Helmbold placed advertisements for his remedy along the route of his Union Pacific Railroad from coast to coast. And he had these enormous advertisements for his patent medication that he placed on business walls, rocks, trees, people's private homes, and fences with zero regard for whether they wanted the ad there or not. There were said to be gargantuan ads that covered both sides of Niagara Falls, the Palisades of the Hudson River, the Rockies, and the Sierras. Dr. Helmbold also targeted a specific demographic with his now famous elixir. He created a pamphlet for his product called The Patient's Guide, a treatise on diseases of the sexual organs or the human condition saved from wreck, that was designed to alert sex workers and their patrons for a cure to the sexual ailments that may have been caused by, quote, excesses in married life, early indiscretions, or self-abuse, end quote. He placed these in public toilets and hotel lobbies to alert people to available treatment of secret diseases. After the U.S. Civil War, many people searched for a cure-all to the physical and mental anguish they'd experienced as a result of the war, and the buchu elixir seemed to be doing the job. Pretty soon, Dr. Helmbold was making a lot of money from his special elixir. He ended up moving from Philadelphia to New York City, where he built a $250,000 temple of pharmacy that he described as, and I apologize on his behalf for how terrible this is, quote, the most beautiful structure on Broadway, end quote. As one of the leading patent medication manufacturers in the country, Dr. Helmbold was hailed as the king of the druggists. He went on to earn over $1 million during the mid to late 1800s. His name and his product were clearly very well known throughout the country. He was able to host famous dignitaries at his home, including notables such as President Ulysses S. Grant. So this guy was not your average Joe. Dr. Helmbold and his wife lived in a large cottage on Chelsea Avenue near the ocean in Long Branch, New Jersey. Helmbold was often described as an eccentric man, but perhaps that could be expected from someone who came into a lot of money. He was known to spend his money recklessly. He commissioned a bust of himself to be carved from rare and exotic woods. He also engaged in what people at the time described as odd, like he squandered his money, but today seems almost philanthropic. He was said to have donated $100,000 to a political campaign fund, spent $20,000 on a team of white horses, paid a poor shoemaker $100 for tapping the heels of his shoes, and bought out all the bouquets of a girl selling flowers in a hotel lobby. I don't know. This doesn't seem particularly odd to me, except maybe for the team of white horses, but at the time, it raised more than a few eyebrows. The psychiatric downfall of Dr. Helmbold is only really described by him, and of course, most people with severe mental illness don't recognize or understand their symptoms as they are happening. They are best observed by others who see the gradual changes. Unfortunately, we don't have any other accounts of his behavior during this time, so it's hard to say whether Dr. Helmbold was experiencing true psychosis or if he was being falsely accused, as he alleged so many times. His account goes something like this. One afternoon in July 1871, when he was living in the seaside home in Long Branch, he decided to take his gun and his coach driver and go for a ride to the beach to shoot at birds. Once he got there, he got out his rifle, raised the rifle, aimed at a bird, and fired. I've been shot, he told his coach driver. He actually had not been shot, spoiler alert, but the gun had been overloaded by someone else and backfired in his face. He wasn't injured from this, just stunned, but he decided to return home, and he didn't tell his wife or kids about the accident. Somehow, though, the story had been misreported to the press. When the evening newspapers came out, the front headline read that the famous Dr. Henry T. Helmbold had died by suicide. Imagine picking up the newspaper only to read on the front page that you were dead from suicide. I imagine that Dr. Helmbold was quite taken aback by the report. And by the next morning, all the newspapers from New York to New Jersey were reporting on the death of Dr. Helmbold. Some claimed he was still clinging to life, while others claimed he had shot himself in the heart or the head, or one really grossly claimed that he had shot off half of his head. Pretty soon, Mrs. Helmbold began receiving telegrams from friends expressing their condolences. Meanwhile, Dr. Helmbold was alive and well and trying to stop the rumors from spreading farther. But it was no use. The damage had already been done. Once people began to realize that Dr. Helmbold was not actually dead, they worried that maybe the incident had been an attempt of suicide, and perhaps he was not stable enough to continue selling his products. Customers became wary of him and stopped purchasing his elixir and other medicines. His income fell drastically, seemingly overnight. The stress of it all seemed to have physical and psychological consequences for Dr. Helmbold. Again, since we're hearing this from his perspective, it's hard to know what symptoms of mental illness, other than anxiety and stress, he may have been experiencing at the time. But regardless, his personal physician encouraged him to get away and go to Europe. So Dr. Helmbold packed up his wife and children and went to Paris. One of Dr. Helmbold's primary issues was that he was keen on drinking alcohol. It's likely, based upon available reports, that Dr. Helmbold struggled with alcohol addiction. He's often described as drinking to excess or drinking and becoming belligerent. It was no surprise then that once he and his family arrived in Paris, he began drinking, beat someone up, and was sent to jail. While at the jail, he was evaluated and deemed insane and referred to a madhouse called a maison de santé in France. On the way there, Dr. Helmbold escaped from the carriage, and he described it like this, quote, "For a moment I sat still, dumbfounded, dazed. Then I sprang from the carriage without a word, before my companion could arrest my progress, and dashed along the road, literally running for liberty. In all my life, I had never run so fast. I had never had such a cause to run. As Tennyson says, there was a spirit in my feet. Let any man feel as I did, that he is leaving a madhouse behind him, and his feet will have spirit in them also. I passed several pedestrians with the speed of the wind. They stared at me, and one fat man tried to stop me, but I gave him a punch in the abdomen, and he fell kicking on the road, shouting Sacré Dieu at the top of his rather squeaky voice. I rushed by 2 or 3 houses, and then I turned down a little lane that crossed the main road at an angle. I felt fresh, vigorous. I could have run for an hour, but alas, others could run too. My volunteer companion of the carriage had good legs, as he now proved, for despite all my efforts, I saw as I turned the corner of the lane that he was gaining on me. The driver of the carriage also had leaped from his vehicle and joined in the chase. He was a big, burly man, but he could run like a deer. He outstripped my carriage companion, and he was at my very heels. I tried the tactics of the hunted hare. I doubled on my tracks, but in vain. The Jehu seized me and held me like a vice. I struggled frantically. I kicked him and cursed him with all my might, but he never loosened his hold. Although he did not resent my insults or return my blows, probably because he did not understand the former or really feel the latter, or maybe that my carriage companion had told him that I was crazy. He looked at me in a curious way, more compassionate than angry, but he kept me till my carriage companion came up with me. I found resistance was impossible. The coachman alone was too much for me. The 2 men together were simply irresistible. I protested. I assured them that I was as sane as they were themselves. I pleaded to be taken back to Paris to my family, but I was told that my family wished for me to be taken care of for a little while. End quote. It had to be hard to know that his wife had agreed with the arrangement for him to be psychiatrically hospitalized. But Dr. Helmbold was taken to a maison de santé in Neuilly, outside Paris. The place, as it turned out, wasn't so bad. In fact, Dr. Helmbold kind of liked it. He described it as overlooking a grove at the Bois de Boulogne, which was a large and beautiful park with large windows, a library, a reading room, and expansive patios. There were 2 beds in his room, one for him and one for his new guardian, the carriage driver named Pedro. Before too long, Dr. Helmbold had returned to his usual self and was able to discharge from the Maison de Santé. He and his family went to Dresden, Germany for a short while, where they traveled a lot. They returned to Paris in July 1874, now 3 years after his gun accident and the ruin of his reputation. They lived in a house at 75 Avenue Champs-Élysées, just a couple blocks away from the famous Arc de Triomphe. Even back in the 1870s, this was hoity-toity land where only rich people lived. And just for reference and for fun, their home is now a tea room, restaurant, and shop called La Durée that sells extremely expensive and fancy pastries, chocolates, and macaroons. Anyway, Dr. Helmbold hosted a party with the Shah of Persia at his home. Helmbold again drank a little bit too much, smoked a little bit too much, and partied until the police arrived. He again got arrested, evaluated, and sent to a maison de santé, this time outside Paris. Once they arrived, Dr. Helmbold's guardian Pedro got drunk on the job and assaulted a police officer. Generally speaking, if you're assigned to watch someone being sent to an acute psychiatric facility, you're encouraged not to drink while doing so. And while Pedro was being taken into custody, Dr. Helmbold used this as an opportunity to escape. He fled but was caught and taken to a maison de santé in Saussenne, about 17 miles from Paris. Dr. Helmbold noticed right away that this place didn't look like a madhouse. There was a nice view of the garden and the River Seine. He was able to roam the property up to a mile away from the home. Helmbold said he was treated with respect and given a number of freedoms. He was rather close to his psychiatrist, Monsieur Redon, as well as Redon's teenage daughter, Marie. He saw Marie as a sort of daughter figure. He asked Monsieur Redon if he could leave to go to see Paris to see his family. When he said no, Helmbold asked Marie if she could help him leave to see his family. He promised her that he would be back within the week, and she agreed. Before long, Dr. Helmbold was back in Paris and knocking at his family's door. They were surprised but delighted to see him. The next day, however, Helmbold was arrested at his family's home and taken back to Saussenne. This time, instead of Pedro watching him, he had a large, stern man whom Dr. Helmbold called a bulldog of a keeper. He wasn't allowed to do anything this time, but thought of escaping once more. On a day that Monsieur Redon and the bulldog went to Paris, Helmbold was assigned another guardian he called Bulldog Jr. When Bulldog Jr. suddenly got sick, a third keeper showed up to watch him. Helmbold managed to persuade the third keeper to help him escape, and once again he was walking back to Paris. He didn't have an overcoat, so he stood out in the crowd. He stumbled upon a small village and persuaded a family in its broken French to allow him to stay the night before going back to his family's house in Paris. Once he returned to Paris, two men again showed up at his door. From an upstairs window, Dr. Helmbold recognized the bulldog and another man. He asked his wife to send them one way while he jumped out the window and headed in the other direction. He made it as far as the train station that would take him to England. While he waited at the depot, a man who worked for Monsieur Redon showed up. Dr. Helmbold tried to bribe the man to let him leave, but the man was not convinced. And Dr. Helmbold was taken back to Saussenne. Helmbold had 3 friends accompany him this time. "Well, surely you're going to escape again," one of them said to him. Helmbold became deadly serious and said, "Meet me tomorrow night with a carriage. Meet me at midnight at the garden, and you will find me if I'm alive." And so the plans for yet another escape were made. When he arrived back at Saussenne, Dr. Helmbold was moved to a small, unadorned room. The bulldog slept on a bed that had been shoved in front of Helmbold's door to prevent his escape. Certainly, there had to be some way he could get out. He had his plans to meet his friends. So he watched and he waited. And soon, Helmbold noticed that the bulldog seemed to be interested in one of the maids at the home. He waited until the bulldog seemed to be distracted by the maid in another room for a rather long period of time. He then dipped his bed frame on its side, climbed it like a ladder, and squeezed his small frame out of the grate over his door. He moved to an unoccupied room and opened a window. Outside, there was a high wall that circled the maison de santé. He could make a jump for it, but if he missed, there was an actual bulldog that roamed the yard. He held his breath and jumped, landing perfectly on the wall. He hopped down and went to the garden where his friends agreed to meet him. But they weren't there. It was dark, and there was a storm beginning. Drops of rain splashed on him as he continued to wait a while longer for the carriage that would certainly arrive and take him to Paris. The rain got harder, but no one arrived. Helmbold finally decided he would walk the 17 miles back to Paris. 1 mile, then 2. Maybe this was a mistake. It was pouring now, and he was cold and soaked. His feet sloshed in his shoes. What a terrible idea to leave. He could be warm and dry at Sosen, but instead he was in the middle of God knows where. Another mile, then two. He started swearing at himself and ruining his decision. He was hungry, he was thirsty, and now he didn't even have his boots. After he walked 6 miles, he felt absolutely hopeless. And trigger warning here for suicidal ideation. Skip ahead about a minute if you're not in a good space to listen to this. Helmbold approached a train track. In the distance, he could hear a train whistle. This could be it, the end to all his problems. He was cold, wet, hungry, thirsty, pained, hopeless, defeated. A shell of the man who was once the king of the druggists. He approached the tracks and lay down on them. And here's how Helmbold described those moments. Quote, "The rain beat on my prostrate form, but I was so wet that it mattered not now. I closed my eyes. The train came nearer to me. I could hear its increasing roar. I thought in my rags of my wife in her luxurious quarters in Paris. I thought as I lay there an outcast awaiting a horrible death, of my children sleeping sweetly at that moment. I prayed to God to bless them and me, for in a moment I would need his blessing. But where was the train all this time? Why had it not reached me ere this and got rid of me? I heard no longer its gigantic rumble. I raised myself from the track. I looked around me. There was a bright light near me, but it was moving slowly and more slowly. At last, its motion ceased altogether, and the train had stopped. To this day, I do not know the reason why that train stopped. I think it was something connected with the engine. I know that the train people were fussing around the locomotive for some time, but I'm not certain. I never asked. All I do know is that with this providential interposition, for such as it was, in my favor, an intense desire for life came upon me. As intense as my previous disgust. I resolved to make the intended instrument of my destruction the vehicle of my safety. A new vitality seemed to take possession of me, to enter my veins. I rose from the track. I felt as vigorous as though I had not been at the verge of death. I crept swiftly but silently alongside the train. I attracted no attention, but contrived to get on the rear car." End quote. And he did. Jumped on the back of that train, and once it started moving again, hitched a ride all the way back to Paris. This time, though, he wasn't sticking around. He had already been caught 3 times and wanted to get as far away from Paris as he could. As much as he hated to leave Paris, Helmbold left for England. He found himself a place to live and made friends with famous people in London. People like P.T. Barnum, Mr. Beaumont, one of the richest men in England at the time, and this really fascinating sounding guy named C.M. Laughlin, who was a well-known gymnast of the time and a muscular model, and who had also been in the theater. Helmbold appreciated walking around with Laughlin because no one messed with C.M. Laughlin. And once again, Helmbold was back to spending his money recklessly. He spent an exorbitant amount of money on wine. He went to Paris for 2 days at a time, long enough to see his family, but not so long that he would get caught. Before long, Mrs. Helmbold and the children decided to return to the U.S. Henry decided to stick it out a while longer in London, but he soon became lonely. 4 years after he had left for Europe, Dr. Helmbold was on a ship headed back to Boston. From there, he returned to Philadelphia. He first went to his mother's house and then reunited with his wife and children. He celebrated his return by going to the theater and being interviewed by newspaper reporters who wanted to know all about his travel and time in Europe. The next morning, though, 2 men showed up at the Helmbold's door with a warrant for his arrest. "What for?" Helmbold said. "Drunk and disorderly," was the reply. Helmbold disputed the claim, saying he hadn't even had anything to drink. How could he be drunk and disorderly? This had to be a ruse. Then it was, sort of. The men said they had 2 doctor's orders for his commitment. What's more, his friends and family wanted him to be taken care of. 48 hours after his return to Philadelphia, Dr. Helmbold was once again being transported to a psychiatric hospital, this time in Philadelphia. Right away, he planned his escape. He discussed getting a writ of habeas corpus, which could allow him to be legally restored to sanity. Instead, his wife was able to get him a guardian and have him furloughed, essentially having his treatment remanded to their beach home since he wasn't a danger to others. Helmbold said he felt like a semi-prisoner at the beach home. His keeper was, quote, an illiterate Irish keeper that he did not like. One night during a party, his keeper got drunk and attempted to approach Helmbold and say it was his curfew and time to sleep. Helmbold, noticing his keeper was drunk, laughed and said that it was he who needed to be put to bed. Helmbold had 2 of his waiters assist the man into bed, and Helmbold locked the door behind him, trapping his drunken guardian inside. The keeper must have remembered this and later reported it to the asylum because Helmbold was deemed too unstable to remain at his home. He was taken back to the asylum where, of course, he planned his next escape. This time, however, he planned to get out through due process of the law. Here are his words about this time. Quote, by virtue of this writ, I was ultimately brought to the court, examined, permitted to testify in my own behalf, and to badger the doctors who were, in the interest of certain parties and of the asylum, trying to prove me insane. I questioned and cross-questioned these doctors as to the difference between and the characteristics of mania, monomania, sanity, hallucination, eccentricity, insanity, etc. I put them through their catechism on these points until they were sick of me. I asked them through my lawyer if they had read certain books on the brain, and then, when they replied in the affirmative, I told the court that no such books had ever been written. I completely confused them. And although their professed views of my mental condition may have been sincere and honest as far as they were themselves concerned, they were not able to impress them upon the court, for I was decided to be a sane man, and as such was relieved at once from all further imprisonment. End quote. So he was able to be free, for a while at least. But Dr. Helmbold went back to drinking. And to his credit, he wrote about how no doctor had been able to prove whether he was truly mentally ill or just drunk at the time that he got himself in trouble. And I wonder, too, if he was struggling with alcoholism and withdrawals, and if that's what looked like mental illness. I think it's a probable estimation. But regardless, Dr. Helmbold was picked up once again for drunk and disorderly conduct and taken back to the asylum. His guardian this time was another Irishman whom Dr. Helmbold seemed to enjoy. He first attempted to bribe the man into helping him escape. When that didn't work, Helmbold told the man his story of escaping multiple times from French madhouses and assuring him of his sanity. Before long, his new keeper wanted to help him escape, so he did. Helmbold ran to a cave that he had noticed outside, where he hid for the day until 8 p.m. when he knew the hospital would release the bulldogs that patrolled the grounds. He left the cave and climbed a tree. Around 11 p.m., Helmbold decided to make a break for it. He ran for the wall but heard the dogs and immediately turned and ran back to the tree. He knew that the dogs barking would alert the watchman, so he knew his only choice was to jump from the tree to the wall that circled the asylum. And so he jumped, but overestimated himself and jumped clean over the wall and fell to the ground. He got up, limping and sore, and hobbled quickly away from the asylum. Before long, he came across a horse-drawn carriage, and the driver was willing to take Helmbold to a relative's home. When he got there, Helmbold was glad to be with family. There were several children in the home, but he became the favorite for the youngest child, the small fry, he said. He played games with the kids and horsed around with them. From the sound of it, he seemed to be having a great time. But after 2 or 3 days, 2 men came around the house. It's always 2 mysterious men, right? While the maid was distracted, the two men entered the home. Helmbold was giving a child a piggyback ride on all fours when the men burst into the room. The children screamed, the elderly relative was startled, and Helmbold stood up immediately. He didn't want to alarm the old woman or the frantic children, so he said he had business with the men and appeared to go voluntarily with them. As soon as they got outside the house, Helmbold bolted. He fled from the garden and ran down an alleyway. He tried to throw them off while heading back to the house, but they soon caught him and dragged him to a carriage and took him to jail. Dr. Helmbold later claimed that this jail was the worst place he had been to. He overheard someone say, "We will cure him of his mania for escapes." He was put in what he called a dark cell for 2 weeks. He described it as, quote, "dark, coal black, wretchedly ventilated. It is foul and filthy with a rotting floor and no furniture but a straw mattress. The stench is horrible," end quote. Although he doesn't describe how he did this, he said he managed to escape to an underground cellar, which was somehow darker than his dark cell. He stayed there for a day and night, thinking he would escape into a garden, but he was caught. Another time he attempted to escape at night. All of his clothes had been taken away except for pantaloons and stockings. He got halfway to a certain gate before the guard dog found him and, quote, "half devoured me," before he was rescued. I don't even want to think about that. During a third escape attempt, he tried a simpler tactic. He attempted to blend in with a group of visitors, and when they were just about to walk out the gate, a guard discovered him. After each failed attempt, Helmbold said he was severely punished as a means to try to deter his escaping. Instead, the punishment only served to fuel his desire to escape all the more. His fourth escape was successful, but he didn't want to betray the person who had helped him, so he kept this one a secret. After he escaped, he took the train to Long Branch. On the way, he had an idea. He knew the governor. He could appeal to him. So Helmbold first went to Freehold, but the governor wasn't there. He almost gave up, but he ran into his friend, Mr. William H. Conover, the district attorney of Monmouth County, and got his official protection. From there, Helmbold went to Ocean Hotel and bet on horse races. He noticed that while he was there, he noticed a detective who had arrested him before. He left the races and went for a walk on the beach where he was stopped by a detective. To his chagrin, he was there to return him to the asylum. Helmbold and the detective arrived at the train depot a couple minutes too late. They had just missed their train. But Helmbold was clever, and he knew people at the train station saloon. He frequented it often. So Helmbold told the detective that he was hungry, and they headed to the saloon. The three men working at the saloon immediately recognized Helmbold and the situation he was in. All three puffed up their chests and threatened to knock out Helmbold's captor unless he left. The detective immediately left, but issued a $500 bounty for anyone who could catch the escaped madman. Dr. Helmbold, now a fugitive, took a male friend with him wherever he went. They drank, smoked, played cards in Long Branch. Things were fine for a while. Then one day, Dr. Helmbold went for a walk after dinner. As he strolled along the sidewalk, a group of men ambushed him. They gagged him so fiercely he thought he'd be choked to death. He was kicked to the ground, cuffed, and beaten. I'll spare you more details, but suffice it to say that he was brutally assaulted by this group of men, who then transported him to what Helmbold called the lockup. And he described it like this. Quote, "If I had been a convicted murderer, I could not have been thrown into a viler place than this lockup. The floor of this place was of damp, dirty stone. The walls were foul. Ventilation existed not even in name, for there was no pretense in any way for air to get in or for stench to get out. There was no table, no bed in the den, only a broken chair and a heap of straw in the corner. Into this den was I thrown, and in this den I was kept for 36 hours, kept without food or drink or attendance of any kind. I was told afterwards that the report was circulated that I had an attack of delirium tremens and was locked up for safety. I believe I was delirious for a while. I certainly have but an imperfect recollection of what transpired for the next 2 or 3 days, save in isolated facts, as it were." End quote. Helmbold went on to describe how his jailers then went through his pockets, perhaps looking for something, perhaps just stealing whatever they could find. He was in the lockup for several days until he was taken right back to the asylum. Dumped, he said, in front of the asylum like a load of wretchedness. Of course, this is Dr. Helmbold we're talking about. He wouldn't stay very long in the hospital. And here's what he wrote about it. Quote, "How I suffered in the asylum need not here be stated. How weary the days were need not be dilated upon. How long the nights seemed to me in my imprisonment will be readily imagined. But though, of course, I lost my spirits and gradually lost my health, I never lost heart. I never abandoned my faith in my ultimate destiny of escaping from my persecution. And I have escaped. By means which I cannot at present reveal, I left the asylum in which I was confined in the night and took the midnight train to New York City. With all its faults, New York is a free city, and I have found it so. It has been a haven to me." End quote. And this escape marked the end of Dr. Helmbold's memoirs. After his book was written and published, he returned to Long Branch, New Jersey, and lived at his wife's beach cottage. She was able to manage his illness for a while until he began having, quote, "frequent attacks of insanity," and he became dangerous. He was described as having delusions of owning valuable property and exorbitant amounts of money, which was once true, but no longer accurate. He was once again hospitalized in Trenton, this time for good. He died at the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum on Wednesday, October 21st, 1894, at age 66. And that's where I'll end the story of Dr. Helmbold, the king of the druggists, Buchu elixir guru, and apparently the Houdini of the lunatic asylums worldwide. So I hope you can see why I wanted to wait an extra week on this one. Once I found Dr. Helmbold's memoirs, I knew I had to use them. It was hard to find any other information about him, so hearing his perspective, as skewed as it may have been, felt like a gold mine. And I first came across this man during my initial searches of the asylum during the episode on Dorothea Dix, and I knew I had to come back to this story. A millionaire, eccentric man who escaped multiple times from several psychiatric hospitals. Sign me up for that story. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you again for your patience as I let the stories unfold for me and for you. When I started this podcast not too long ago, I had a very formulaic idea of how I wanted each hospital series to be organized. But I found that the stories themselves are not formulaic. So why should I attempt for them to be something that they're not? Could I have told the story of Dr. Helmbold in 20 minutes? Probably. But it would have overlooked so many key aspects of his story in doing so. So, as always, thank you so much for listening. I am continually awed at how many people tune in to listen. Please continue sharing with your friends and colleagues and anyone else who you think might be interested in learning more about these stories about old psych hospitals. And, of course, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.